Judge Gregory Harris sat behind the bench, his black robe draping over his broad shoulders like a shroud of authority. A seasoned judge with decades of experience, he was known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. The courtroom was filled with the usual hum of bureaucracy, lawyers shuffling papers and clients anxiously waiting their turn. Harris scanned the docket, his eyes pausing for a moment on the name of the next defendant, Alia Green. A slight frown creased his forehead. He'd heard whispers about her. A young black woman making waves in the federal workforce, challenging the system, pushing for change. He had his doubts about people like her, those who questioned the established order. As Alia stepped forward, Harris couldn't help but notice the calm confidence in her stride. She was dressed simply, but her presence filled the room with a quiet power. Unlike most people he saw in court, who wore nervousness like a second skin, Alia looked poised. Her dark eyes, framed by neatly pulled back hair, met his with a steady gaze that seemed to challenge him without saying a word. Harris immediately felt a shift, a tension he couldn't place. He cleared his throat, pushing aside his growing curiosity. "Ms. Green, you stand accused of bypassing federal regulations while attempting to implement a new program within your department. The charges are serious," Harris began, his voice deep and authoritative, but with a hint of the skepticism he always felt when dealing with people trying to circumvent the rules. Alia didn't flinch. She spoke with a voice that was both calm and assertive. "Your Honor, I didn't bypass any regulations. I worked within the system, even though it was restrictive. The program I've been working on is about creating a more inclusive and equitable federal workforce, something that's long overdue." Harris raised an eyebrow. His interest piqued, but his judgment still firm. He had seen many people who believed they were changing the world, only to discover that their actions were often more disruptive than transformative. "I'm sure your intentions are good, Ms. Green," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "but the law is clear. There are procedures to follow. If everyone acted outside those lines, chaos would ensue." Alia's eyes never left his. "But, Your Honor, sometimes the law doesn't keep up with the times. The rules that exist were made for a different era. If we're going to move forward as a country, we need to address the systemic barriers that are still holding people back. It's not chaos, it's progress." Harris felt a flicker of discomfort. He was used to the straightforward cases, the ones that fit neatly into the legal framework. But Alia wasn't asking for leniency. She was asking for understanding, for something far more complex than a simple violation of the rules. He shifted in his seat, a thought nagging at the back of his mind. Could she be right? Was he too attached to the old ways of doing things? For the first time in years, Harris found himself questioning his own approach. The courtroom, which usually felt like a controlled environment, suddenly seemed much more uncertain. The hearing continued, but Harris couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary case. Alia Green had always been a woman on a mission, and she wasn't about to let anyone, even a judge, slow her down. Raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs, Alia understood the challenges of navigating a system that often felt like it wasn't built for people like her. From an early age, she saw how people from marginalized communities were often overlooked, ignored, or outright discriminated against. She learned quickly that while hard work mattered, so did access, opportunity, and fairness, things that too many people took for granted. Her journey into federal service began with a deep desire to make things better. She earned her degree in public administration, excelling in her studies while also working part-time jobs to support herself. But it wasn't enough just to land a government job. Alia wanted to change the system from within. She joined the federal workforce determined to break down the barriers that kept talented people from rising through the ranks simply because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic background. She quickly found that the system was far more resistant to change than she had imagined. Over the years, Alia's efforts to push for diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) programs were met with varying degrees of resistance. Her first proposal to introduce mentorship programs for underrepresented groups was shot down by senior staff, who deemed it unnecessary. A later effort to adjust hiring practices to ensure fairer representation in leadership positions was dismissed as too radical. But Alia wasn't one to back down. If anything, each setback only fueled her resolve. She realized that while people paid lip service to change, the structures in place were deeply ingrained, and challenging them required more than just good intentions. It required a fight. Her current initiative, the one that had led her into the courtroom, was her most ambitious yet. Alia had begun drafting a comprehensive reform plan aimed at modernizing federal workforce laws to better reflect the current landscape of diversity and inclusion. The laws that governed promotions, hiring, and professional development had been set in place decades ago, and many were now outdated and biased. Alia's plan sought to overhaul these policies, pushing for clear guidelines that would eliminate barriers to advancement based on race, gender, and other factors that had historically been used to exclude certain groups. But as she began to push her proposal through internal channels, the pushback was swift and intense. Some argued that her ideas were too radical, others called her efforts an overreach. Yet Alia remained steadfast. She had already spent years researching best practices, consulting experts, and gathering data to support her plan. The evidence was clear. The federal workforce needed to change, and she was ready to lead that charge. But what she hadn't anticipated was that her work would soon land her in a courtroom, facing a judge who believed in the very system she was trying to reform. Though the courtroom was an intimidating place for many, Alia wasn't afraid. In fact, she saw it as just another step in her mission to reshape the federal system, an obstacle to overcome, not a defeat. But deep down, she couldn't shake the thought. If she could convince even one person, the judge, to see things her way, perhaps this battle could spark a larger movement. Judge Gregory Harris sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Alia Green as she spoke with conviction. She had a fire in her eyes that Harris couldn't ignore. Yet, despite her passion, the judge's mind remained firmly anchored in the rigid traditions that had governed his career for over 3 decades. He wasn't swayed easily by persuasive rhetoric, and Alia's words, while compelling, didn't change his belief that rules existed for a reason. The law was the law, and no amount of idealism would change that. As Alia continued to defend her actions, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of discomfort creeping in. Her plan to overhaul the system was clearly ambitious, but was it really practical? Could one person truly challenge the very framework that had governed the federal workforce for generations? To him, her actions seemed impulsive, rash even, more of an attempt to bend the system to her will than a thoughtful, calculated approach to reform. "Ms. Green," Harris said, his voice deliberate and measured, "the law doesn't exist to be upended on a whim. If everyone decided to disregard regulations because they believed something was outdated, there would be no structure left to uphold. We'd be left with chaos." Alia didn't flinch. She responded calmly, "Your Honor, I'm not asking for chaos. I'm asking for progress. The system you're defending was built in an era that didn't account for the diversity we see today. It's a system that still excludes talented individuals based on outdated biases. My goal is to work within the system, but also to change it where it's holding us back." Harris frowned. He had heard similar arguments from activists and reformers throughout his career, but he had never been convinced by their calls for change. In his experience, those who pushed for reform often failed to see the unintended consequences that came with it. The established system had its flaws, yes, but it also had stability, something that was often more valuable than the uncertain future promised by change. As Alia spoke, her words became less about defending herself and more about defending her cause. She painted a picture of a future where the federal workforce was truly representative of the people it served, where promotions and hiring decisions weren't based on outdated ideas of who was qualified, but on a person's abilities, regardless of their race, gender, or background. It was an inspiring vision, but Harris couldn't help but wonder if it was too idealistic for the real world. For a moment, the courtroom fell into silence. Harris's mind raced as he considered Alia's arguments. Was she right? Were the laws he had enforced for so long actually contributing to inequality in subtle, insidious ways? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling his usually firm beliefs. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was rare for a case to shake him to his core like this. His eyes met Alia's, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what to think. The courtroom session ended for the day, but Judge Harris's thoughts didn't. As he left the bench and walked toward his chambers, his mind replayed Alia's words over and over. He had heard similar calls for reform before, but something about her conviction, the calm yet powerful way she articulated her vision, stuck with him. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the pressure of a complex case. But as he sat at his desk that evening, the nagging question remained, was the system really as fair as he believed? Harris found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, researching. He pulled up old records of federal workforce laws, some of which had been written decades ago, long before the demographic shifts and societal changes that had reshaped the country. He pored over data about diversity, or rather, the lack of it, in the federal workforce. The numbers were stark. Minorities and women still faced systemic barriers to career advancement. Harris couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. There were glaring discrepancies, and many of the laws he had upheld throughout his career had perpetuated those disparities, whether intentionally or not. The more Harris read, the more he began to understand the weight of Alia's efforts. He had always been a defender of tradition, believing that following the letter of the law was the best way to preserve order. But he was beginning to realize that this belief was built on a foundation that had long since cracked. The systems in place were not just outdated. They were actively holding back the potential of qualified individuals, simply because of who they were or where they came from. Harris's respect for the rule of law was unwavering, but he now saw that laws could evolve, that the system could be reshaped. Alia had not come to court to simply challenge a fine. She had come to challenge the system itself. And as he reflected on her words, Harris understood that her fight wasn't just about one woman's struggle. It was about making the federal workforce a place where everyone truly had an equal opportunity to succeed. Despite the growing sense of admiration he felt for Alia's determination, Harris wasn't ready to leap into full agreement just yet. He had always been a cautious man, one who needed concrete steps and clear plans before making a decision. But there was one thing he was sure of: he couldn't ignore the call for change anymore. The next day, he made a decision. He would attend a presentation that Alia had invited him to, a briefing on her reform plan. He knew it was a risk. It might confirm his doubts, or it might open his eyes to something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Either way, he had to see it for himself. As he prepared to leave his chambers, Harris couldn't help but feel that something was shifting. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that perhaps the law wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about understanding when those rules needed to change. Judge Gregory Harris arrived early at the venue where Alia Green was scheduled to present her reform plan. He had spent the previous night weighing the pros and cons of attending. There was still a part of him that doubted whether the changes she proposed could truly make a difference. The more he read about her initiatives, the more it became clear that they weren't just about fixing a few broken policies. They were about dismantling and rebuilding a system from the ground up. It was a bold vision, and it scared him. As he entered the small auditorium, Harris was greeted by a few colleagues who were already seated, but his mind was elsewhere. Alia's presence at the front of the room commanded attention even before she started speaking. Dressed in a simple yet elegant suit, she exuded the same confidence that had struck him in the courtroom. But there was no hint of the tension he had observed earlier. She was poised, prepared and ready to present her vision for a new federal workforce. The room quieted as Alia began. "Thank you all for being here today," she said, her voice clear and steady. "What we're going to discuss today is not just about diversity, not just about inclusion. It's about reshaping the future of our government. The policies we've been operating under for decades are failing to address the needs of the people they are supposed to serve. They're outdated, and they're holding us back. Harris listened intently as Alia outlined her plan. It was an ambitious roadmap to modernize federal hiring practices, promote equitable access to career advancement, and create a more inclusive environment for all employees. But what struck him wasn't just the depth of her knowledge. It was the thoughtfulness and research behind each proposal. She wasn't simply advocating for change because it felt good or was politically correct. She was using data and evidence to show how the current system was failing. She spoke of disparities in hiring and promotions, where people of color and women were often passed over for leadership roles despite having the qualifications. She explained how the existing framework perpetuated biases in ways that most people didn't even realize. But it wasn't all criticism. Alia also offered clear, actionable solutions, from changing how job qualifications were assessed to introducing mentoring programs for underrepresented groups in federal service. Every proposal was designed not just to fix a symptom, but to address the root causes of inequality. As Alia spoke, Harris felt a shift inside him. He had always been a man of facts, of concrete evidence. What she presented wasn't some abstract ideal. It was a carefully researched blueprint for change. Her plan made sense. The data supported it. But even more than that, it became clear to him that Alia was more than just an activist or an idealist. She was a pragmatist, a woman who understood that real change was messy, complicated, and required more than just good intentions. It required sacrifice, collaboration, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. By the end of the presentation, Harris was no longer questioning whether Alia's vision could work. He was grappling with the realization that it had to work. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the system he had once so rigidly defended. Could it really be as broken as she said? And if so, was it his responsibility, as a judge, to help fix it? As the room filled with applause, Harris sat frozen in his seat, still processing what he had heard. One thing was clear. Alia Green had changed the way he saw the future of the federal workforce, and possibly the way he saw the law itself. The following days were a blur for Judge Harris. What had begun as a straightforward case about a fine for a seemingly minor violation had morphed into something far more complicated. As the pressure from his colleagues to finalize a ruling on Alia's case mounted, Harris found himself caught between his professional duty and the growing realization that the world he had always known, the legal system, the federal workforce, even his own role within it, might not be as just and unyielding as he had believed. He spent hours going over Alia's proposal again, looking at the statistics she had presented, the studies from workforce experts, and the case studies from other organizations that had implemented similar reforms. Each page he turned, each number he analyzed, seemed to confirm what she had argued. The system was broken. The federal workforce laws, though once designed with good intentions, had become obstacles to progress, perpetuating inequality and exclusion. Harris knew this was no ordinary case, and he felt the weight of it more with each passing hour. His peers, however, were pushing him in the opposite direction. They expected a ruling based on the letter of the law. Nothing more, nothing less. "We don't change laws from the bench," Harris, one of his colleagues, had told him the day before. "You're a judge, not a policymaker. It's not your place to challenge the system. It's your job to enforce it." But Harris found it harder and harder to ignore the facts before him. Alia's vision wasn't just a vague idea. It was backed by years of research, data, and real-world examples of how change could work. What she was proposing wasn't chaos. It was a carefully constructed plan for a future where everyone, regardless of background, had an equal shot at success in the federal workforce. The more Harris thought about it, the more he began to see the parallels between her work and his own career. Both were, in their own ways, about justice. Alia was fighting for a more equitable system, just as he had once fought for fairness in his courtroom. The choice he now faced was a daunting one. Should he stand by the rules he had upheld for so long, enforcing a fine for Aaliyah's perceived violation of them, or should he take a stand for the change that he now saw was necessary? If he issued the fine, he would be upholding the law, but he would also be contributing to a system that was, in many ways, outdated and inequitable. If he ruled in her favor, though, he would be making a bold statement, one that could have far-reaching implications for the future of the federal workforce. It could even set a precedent for how legal institutions viewed systemic reform. But could he do it? Could he challenge the very system that had shaped his entire career? As the days drew closer to the hearing, Harris found himself unable to sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, Aaliyah's words echoed in his mind, challenging everything he had believed to be true. There was no easy answer, only the uncomfortable realization that doing what was right wasn't always the same as doing what was easy. The day of the ruling arrived, and Judge Gregory Harris entered the courtroom with a heavy heart. The buzz of anticipation in the air seemed to weigh down on him more than ever before. The gavel, which he had used countless times to maintain order and dispense justice, felt unusually heavy in his hand. He glanced over at Aaliyah Green, who sat across from him, her expression composed yet resolute. She had no idea what direction he would take, but Harris knew that whatever decision he made would not only affect her future, but the future of the federal workforce, possibly even the nation. Harris had spent days mulling over the case, balancing his duty as a judge with the growing sense of responsibility he felt toward the ideals Aaliyah had shared with him. He had listened to the arguments, read the data, and even considered the real-world consequences of upholding outdated laws versus implementing the kind of change she was advocating. It was an agonizing internal conflict. On one hand, the rule of law demanded consistency and stability. On the other, Aaliyah's vision had made it impossible for him to ignore the glaring flaws in the system he had spent a lifetime upholding. The room quieted as he stood at the bench. His colleagues, who had expected him to follow the letter of the law and impose the fine, were now waiting for the final decision. He cleared his throat and began. This case presents a unique challenge, one that forces me to consider not only the facts before me, but also the broader implications for the future of our society. The words felt heavy as they left his mouth. Harris could sense the tension in the room, the weight of history hanging in the balance. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch for a moment, before continuing. Aaliyah Green's actions were indeed in violation of certain established regulations. However, what she has presented is not a simple disregard for the law. Rather, it is a call for meaningful reform, a vision that challenges the very framework of how we understand fairness and opportunity within our federal institutions. Aaliyah's eyes met his, a flicker of hope igniting in them. She had fought for this moment, for the chance to be heard, and now it seemed her efforts were not in vain. Harris took a deep breath. The system that governs our federal workforce was designed to ensure fairness, but as Ms. Green has shown, it no longer serves that purpose in its current form. The inequalities that persist in hiring, promotion, and career advancement are real, and they cannot be ignored. He glanced down at his notes one last time, then looked up to address the room. While it is not within my power as a judge to create new laws, I cannot, in good conscience, continue to uphold a system that perpetuates inequality. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of Ms. Green's initiative. The fines are dismissed, and I will recommend further review of federal workforce laws to ensure they align with the values of inclusion and equity. Aaliyah blinked in disbelief. The room erupted into a mixture of surprise and quiet applause. For Harris, however, the silence that followed felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had made the right choice, an imperfect one, but one that leaned toward justice, not just for Aaliyah, but for the countless others who had been held back by a system that no longer worked. The days following Judge Harris' ruling were a whirlwind. Aaliyah Green found herself at the center of a media storm. News outlets covered the unprecedented decision, and commentators debated the implications of his ruling for the future of federal policies. What had started as a seemingly routine legal matter had turned into a pivotal moment in the fight for reform within the federal workforce. But for Aaliyah, the recognition and media attention were secondary. She was focused on what came next, turning her vision into reality. For Judge Harris, the aftermath of his ruling brought with it a mix of emotions. He had expected backlash from some corners, and he wasn't disappointed. A number of his colleagues privately criticized his decision, claiming he had overstepped his role. Yet, Harris couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of validation he felt as more and more people came forward to express support for Aaliyah's initiative. Many within the federal workforce, employees who had long been silenced by the system, began to speak out about their own struggles, sharing stories of discrimination, limited opportunities, and systemic bias. But despite the public accolades and the swell of support, Aaliyah knew the hard work was just beginning. The ruling had opened the door, but now she had to push through it. She needed to collaborate with lawmakers, experts, and advocates to bring her comprehensive reform plan into law. The battle was far from over, but now, with a powerful judicial endorsement behind her, she had a stronger platform from which to advocate. Aaliyah reached out to Judge Harris to express her gratitude, though she was careful not to make it sound like a political maneuver. She wanted him to know that his decision had validated her fight and reignited her determination to press forward. Harris, in turn, invited Aaliyah to meet with him in his chambers. He had a number of questions. He wanted to understand more about the nuances of her plan and how he could help further the cause. It was clear that for Harris, this wasn't just about one ruling. It was about acknowledging the deep-seated issue in the fabric of the federal system, one that he could no longer ignore. Ms. Green, Harris said during their meeting, "I have to admit, I never imagined that my decision would spark this much conversation. But what you're doing, it's important, and I want to be part of that change. However I can help, I will." Aaliyah smiled, her confidence growing with every word. "Thank you, Your Honor. Your decision made it possible for us to take this step. But we need more allies, more people who are willing to stand up and push for change, even when it's difficult. The system won't change overnight, but this is a start." In that moment, both Aaliyah and Judge Harris realized that this wasn't just a victory for one person or one case. It was a victory for a movement that could reshape the very nature of the federal workforce, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, had a fair chance to succeed. As they left his chambers, there was a sense of shared purpose. The road ahead was long, but with the right people behind it, change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The journey of reform had just begun.